Hey guys, I hope you made it through the first week okay. I know there's some issues with Schoology, but good job being resilient and working through it all. Hopefully, this upcoming week will be a little bit smoother as we transition to Google Classroom. Make sure that you reach out to me if you have any questions or any concerns. Now, what we're heading into is week two. We're going to talk about the compromises that led up to the US Civil War. In a lot of ways, we've been taught throughout our lives that compromise is one of the best solutions to any sort of issues. And in a lot of ways, it is, but sometimes compromise can lead to bigger issues, as we're going to see here with the compromises leading up to the Civil War. And it all starts a long time ago in 1820, actually. Now, in 1820, we can actually recall further back. In 1803, the United States makes a huge land purchase from France, and that, you probably recall, is the Louisiana Territory. Now, as we purchased this land, a question started to arise. Should we allow slavery into this new territory that we've purchased? Well, you have Southerners, specifically out of Louisiana where slavery is already legal, claiming that, slavery should exist in the whole territory. I mean, it is Louisiana territory, so we should have slavery everywhere. Northerners are saying we should have slavery nowhere. And so we have to strike a deal or a compromise here called the Missouri Compromise 1820. Now, by 1819, there are 22 states in the U.S. 11 of those states are free states, and 11 of those states are slave states. And it was very important that we had 11 and 11, or a balanced number at the time, so that way neither side had more power than the other in the federal government, specifically in the Senate. If you remember, there's 2 representatives per state in the Senate. Well, if we have 11 and 11, each side has 22 representatives. And so it kept it balanced, it kept it fair in a lot of their eyes. Well, by 1819, Missouri has enough people and asks to join the United States as a slave state. Well, Northerners dramatically oppose this idea because if we accept Missouri, now there's 12 slave states and 11 free states, and that's completely unacceptable. So a compromise is struck. And in that compromise, we make the agreement that Missouri would join the United States as a slave state, making 12 slave states. But we'd also allow Maine, which used to be part of Massachusetts, to join as an independent state as well, being a slave state. So now we have 12 slave states, 12 free states. It's all fair. They like that. But there's a bigger issue. What about as we move further and further west? How are we going to handle issues in the future? And so we made an additional deal with this. And it says that slavery would be banned anywhere north of the 36-degree parallel. And slavery would be legal any place south of it. The only exception here was Missouri. Missouri would remain a slave state, even though it's north of the line, but any other states north of this line would be free states, and any states south would be slave states. And so we see a line is our compromise. A line is the defining factor, right? We're going to make that our decision. Now, it's important to know this is not the first time we've used a line. We also had the Mason and Dixon line, clear back in the early 1800s, which essentially used the Ohio River right through here, and said that states north of that Ohio River were free states, and states south were going to be slave states. And so we see a lot of our decisions were made off of degrees, off of lines, and that creates a lot of issues coming forward, especially in 1850. Now, if we remember from third quarter, in 1850, or specifically here in 1846, starting in 1846, the Mexican-American War takes place. By 1848, Mexico has lost their entire Southwest Territory, or what would be their Northwest Territory, and we've gained what we call our Southwest Territory, which is all this territory of Texas, New Mexico, Utah, California. Well, as we gained that territory, we recall, we had a gold rush in California, so hundreds of thousands of people moved to California. Well, as they gain this huge amount of population, California decides to ask to become admitted as a state into the country. Well, they request to join the country as an anti-slavery state. Well, this starts to create some issues, right? And one of the first issues that arises is, should we allow slavery or not into the Southwest Territory? According to the Missouri Compromise, any place beneath the 36-degree parallel would be slave states, and any place north would be free states. But that doesn't really work for a lot of people. And so a man, a Senator Wilmot, he presents this idea to the House of Representatives and says we should ban slavery in the entire Southwest Territory, and we'd call it the Wilmot Proviso. It passed the House. The House of Representatives said, yep, no slavery in that area. When it gets to the Senate, and remember, this is where everything is split. This is where it's even. 12 slave states, 12 free states. They decide, no, we can't do this. But the bigger issue that it causes is it infuriates Southerners. They feel like the institution of slavery is being attacked yet again because we're trying to ban the expansion of slavery. But this also leads to a new political party called the Free Soil Party. That Free Soil Party wasn't somebody who really wanted to end slavery like abolitionists were, but they wanted no slavery in the West. And so we start to see politically, we're splitting as a country more and more. And at the time, we have the Whig Party, which essentially is kind of an anti-slavery party. You have the Democratic Party, which is usually pro-slavery, and you have the Free Soiler Party, who's saying, we don't want to end slavery, but we don't want to move it west. But we start to see more and more issues are arising here. And Henry Clay presents a compromise in 1848 or 1849. Now, Henry Clay was on his deathbed. He was about to die. So it was mainly pushed forward by a man named Daniel Webster. And in this compromise, he says, we'll allow California to enter as a free state, and we'll make some concessions or agreements with Southerners. Well, this again creates issues with the Southerners, led by a man named John C. Calhoun, who says that, no, we're not admitting California as a free state. The institution of slavery is under attack. And if you admit California as a free state, then we're going to succeed as the South. We're going to break away. Well, it never actually happens, but you start to see the threats taking place here that eventually lead to the Civil War. Well, the compromise that Henry Clay and Daniel Webster create presents this, and this is what ultimately is passed. California becomes a free state. Utah and New Mexico, even though the part of it is beneath the 36th degree parallel, they'd become what we call popular sovereignty states. So they would choose if they were going to be free or slave states. So we see that Missouri Compromise is kind of starting to go away a little bit already. And they'd get to pick, right? Pretty confident that New Mexico would probably become a slave state because of how close it is to Texas. Utah could be going either way. So the Southerners kind of like this idea. Slave trade was banned in D.C. You could no longer trade slaves in D.C. Southerners didn't like this much, but they made the agreement. Due to the last one, the Fugitive Slave Act was enforced. Now, what the Fugitive Slave Act said was that any slave who escaped the South to the North on things like the Underground Railroad or just simply running away, that Northerners were forced to assist and return any escaped slaves that they found in the North. In addition, Southerners could go to the North searching for their slaves, and if they found their slave, then they could return them back south. Well, this creates some conflict. Northerners feel like their popular sovereignty is being taken away, that they don't have their own laws and rights and freedoms in the North, that Southerners can just walk in and ignore the laws of the North. They also fear that slaves or African Americans who had never been slaves might be accused of being slaves. And if they're accused, it's pretty tough to defend them, and free African Americans might be taken south. So it starts to create this conflict between the North and the South that eventually leads to an event called the Dred Scott Trial, which we'll talk about more later. But that's not the final compromise that takes place. Another compromise takes place in 1852 called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, it's introduced by a man named Stephen Douglas. Now, Stephen Douglas is famous for the Douglas-Lincoln debates, where he debates Abraham Lincoln, vying for presidency in 1860. We know Lincoln ends up winning. But Stephen Douglas was a representative from the state of Illinois, and he proposes that we remove the Missouri Compromise, that we no longer use a line to decide what are slave and what are free states. And instead, let's just institute popular sovereignty throughout the entire West. And that was ultimately the decision that was made. We would allow all these Western states to decide, are they going to be slave or free states? Southerners liked the idea because they could, potentially gain some power here. Northerners hated it because they feared that everything they were fighting for to end slavery was going to be overturned. Now, Stephen Douglas did have some motive here. During the time we were building the Transcontinental Railroad, which was a railroad from essentially from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean to improve trade and travel. And he wanted that railroad to come through Illinois in the north and not go through the south because it would bring a lot of money and opportunity to Illinois. And so the rule was if, popular sovereignty was in the west, then the railroad would go through Illinois. And that's exactly what happened. But it creates a bigger issue here called Bleeding Kansas. Now, as a result of this, starting in 1852, thousands of Northerners and Southerners start rushing into the state of Kansas, or the territory of Kansas. Now, their goal was to try to make Kansas either a slave or a free state. If they had more Northerners there, it'd become a free state. If they had more Southerners, it'd become a slave state. Well, naturally, as you can probably guess, when you have two people of completely different beliefs in a tight or, confined area, conflict erupts. And the biggest conflict is known by a man, or led by a man named John Brown. And we see him in his picture kind of up here. He was an abolitionist. He was not afraid to use violence to try and get his way. And one of the biggest events that he leads is that what we call Potawatomi Creek, and he leads several dozen Northerners, anti-slavery individuals, and he attacks a group of pro-slavery individuals and kills 5 of them at this creek. This creates outrage within the state of Kansas, and Northerners and Southerners are in conflict, and it creates this kind of mini civil war. But it's not confined to just Kansas. We also start to see conflict between Northerners and Southerners in the government itself. A man named Charles Sumner, who was a senator from Massachusetts, was giving a speech on the Senate floor. And as he's giving this speech, or he gave this speech, essentially attacking slavery in the South and the institution. Well, a couple days later, when the Senate reconvened and they were in the Senate floor again, Charles Sumner is in his chair at his location, right where he's supposed to sit. And a congressman from the House of Representatives named Preston Brooks comes into the Senate, walks up to Charles Sumner, and canes him. That means he used his cane, like a walking cane, and starts beating him with it. He beat him so fiercely that Charles Sumner is knocked unconscious. He is oozing and gushing blood from the head, and nobody does anything. Nobody intervened. Nobody tried to stop Preston Brooks. Nobody came to Charles Sumner's aid. Nothing. Charles Sumner would have lifelong injuries because of this. However, it shows how divided the Senate was. They were so afraid that if somebody tried to intervene here, that a bigger issue would arise. And eventually we see that in 1857 in what we call the Dred Scott case. Now, all these compromises that the government had been created confusion in the country. We didn't know, what the rules were. Communication was slow at the time. If you were taken to a free state, were you a free person? If you're taken to a slave state, were you a slave person? Like, how did it all work? And that confusion and that misrepresentation comes alive in this case. And Dred Scott, who we see over here on the right, he was a slave and had been born a slave. And he was brought to Northern Territory by his master, right? And as he was brought to these new territories, he claimed that he should be a free man because he was brought to free territory. 10th Amendment allows people or states to choose, their own laws as long as the federal government doesn't say anything against it. And as he's brought into these territories, he says, the law here is that I'm free, so I should therefore be free forever. His owner said, no, he's your property. We purchased him. And therefore, if we take him anywhere, he's still our property. And this makes its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. In 1857, the Supreme Court will make a decision on this case that is oftentimes going down as the most controversial Supreme Court decision in U.S. history, and it will rock the country. We'll look more at that in the upcoming days.